when the question answering of one talk is going on, the next speaker may actually come up here and be prepared, so that he or she can start talking immediately, right? Okay. So I'll hand over to our session chair for today, Professor Kuntal Ghosh from ISI Kolkata. So I would request him to call up the first.
Yeah, thank you so much, Saptarshi. So as Saptarshi has mentioned, let us stick to the time as much as possible, particularly after the morning session where we had such a beautiful keynote lecture, but perfectly maintained with time, explaining so many things. So let us follow his example. So the first speaker is Diptesh. Diptesh, please come up. Yeah.
Good morning all of you. My name is Diptesh Kanodia. I am a student of the IITB Monash Research Academy, and these are my supervisors, Professor Pushpak Bhattacharya, Professor Malhar Kulkarni, and Professor Raza Haffari. I am here to talk about cognate identification to improve phylogenetics for Indian languages. Now, cognate identification means we have to identify cognate words, and cognate words are a pair or more words, or like cognate sets, which have a similar origin, which means they share some sort of etymological history. Cognates are present in multiple variants of the same text. So if you want to take an example, let's take up Mahabharata, which has like 70-80 different versions across India. But if you want to identify the source of all these versions, the source of all these different versions, if you want to trace the root of all this, then you probably want to club them into families and hypothesize a common parent or a common ancestor. So for clubbing them into same families, you have to either identify the similarity between two versions of these manuscripts, or you have to identify cognates from these. So we took up the path of cognate identification and tried to improve phylogenetics. And this is what my work is. The motivation behind this is cognate identification can be applied not just for phylogenetics, but it can also be helpful for machine translation, information retrieval, and other such languages. An example for cognates is that if you take the word putra for Sanskrit, the Hindi word putra, the Marathi putra, and the Punjabi word putter, all of these mean son, and this is an example of a cognate set. There has been a lot of work done in cognate identification, particularly by Melamed and Kondrak, and people have explored three different type of ways vaguely to identify cognates. The first path would be you either identify the orthographic similarity using string similarity methods. The second part is you try to look at the phonetic similarity between two words, and the third part is you look at the semantic similarity between two words. We tried to, for this particular work, we only use the orthographic similarity method, and we try to identify two cognates in a pair of languages using only string similarity methods. For this, we use Indo-WordNet, and we take up 4 languages, particularly Hindi, Marathi, Sanskrit, and Punjabi, and we create the data set of 15,000 unique words from all these 4 languages by taking data from WordNets. And these unique words were available to us publicly from the WordNet data set. We only took out the unique words from the word lists which WordNet gives. Why WordNet? It's because WordNet has everything curated in the form of synsets, which means that there would be a high probability of getting a cognate from parallel common concepts. We use the baseline measure X dice and the normal string similarity based measures like edit distance, and we try to detect cognates using these orthographic similarity based methods. We also try to experiment with the phonetic aspects of words by decomposing them into phonetically and aligning them according to phonemes, but that particularly did not work out well for us. We used the string similarity measures finally, and after decomposing a word into shingle sets, or after doing the positional tokenization, cutting them across characters, we try to measure the similarity between all these sets, between two sets created for two particular words, and we arrive empirically we arrive at the value of 0.75, which means that if two words have 75% similarity across them, we decided for our algorithm that they should be output as probable cognate pair. after doing that, after getting these probable cognate pairs, what we did was we manually got them curated using the help of a lexicographer, and we gave the data output to lexicographers to find out whether these words were actually cognates or not. So our lexicographers manually verified that for Hindi Punjabi, out of 798 detected cognates, only 497 were actual cognates and they had etymological history. For Hindi Marathi, out of 905, only 621 were actual cognates, and for Hindi Sanskrit, out of the 589 detected cognate pairs, they found out that only 378 were actual cognates. Why this huge error rate? I would like to explain this because this in particular has a lot of future work associated with our work. It's probably because we cut Hindi and Punjabi and Marathi words across characters. When you do that, in Unicode encoding, the matras are different characters, the halant and the visargs are different characters. Instead, we could have rather done, which we found out after a whole lot of discussion from the poster session, instead we could have cut them after every vowel, so that the matra, along with the character, consonant character, sort of becomes a phoneme or sort of a shingle set for us. So that's probably why the huge error rate, and we'll try to sort of mitigate this in future work. The second part of this paper is called the textual history tool. So we also implement our this web UI called the textual history tool and try to verify the impact of our work on cognate detection. This web UI allows a lexicographer to manually type in the different text versions of a manuscript, and it facilitates the input of manuscript data and helps digitizing the versions. So I talked about Mahabharata. There are a lot of different versions across India, and just like that, there are a lot of other Sanskrit texts which are not digitally available to us. So this web UI, which kind of looks like this, allows a lexicographer to manually input all the data, allows them to label, and allows them to also type in the additional notes which are provided along with on those textual versions. So this is how this UI sort of looks. In the interest of time, I would not get into details of the architecture of the history tool. Some important insights after this work, because we only tried the orthographic similarity based measures or the string similarity based measures, we found out that we could easily detect the category of tatsama words. We manually gave the output to lexicographers, right? And they identified for us that these pair of words are tatsama words and tadbhava words. We could easily identify the tatsama words because there are not a lot of orthographical changes in these cognate pairs, but for tadbhava words, they take a sort of a different form when go from one language to another. For example, if a word from Sanskrit is derived in Hindi, tadbhava words take a different form and they are hard to detect orthographically. So this also poses a new challenge and gives us a lot for our future work. So this is something that we are probably going to look for in the future. So that was my presentation. We describe our work on cognate detection for Indian language pairs, Sanskrit Hindi, Sanskrit Marathi and Sanskrit Punjabi. And in the phylogenetic tree creation mode, we verify the cognate sets help in better phylogenetic tree creation. And we will release this cognate data set publicly. We are also in for preparing a gold data set for cognate pairs across many Indian languages. So that is also something that we would release. These are the references. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Diptesh, for a very crisp presentation. We can allow a couple of questions. Anybody wants to ask a question?
Please, I'm all ready to be grilled.
Yeah. So if they don't have, I have one, Diptesh.
No, they do have a question, yeah.
Hi, Diptesh. Yeah, sorry, I was late in the talk. So for finding cognates, were you using the phonemes or syllables or what kind of? So you should have used a transliteration scheme and then done that, I think. Yes, yes, yeah. Sure, sure. Because you are working with Sanskrit, so you will also have all the details about the characters of each of the character that you are using. So that would be good.
Thank you. Anybody else? So I don't want to elaborate because it was related to that question actually. So thank you so much. The next speaker, please, Santosh, right?
Myself, Santosh. This is a joint work with Aravind from IIT Kharagpur. So I just speak on this hate speech detection problem in Hindi, English, code mixed social media text. So yeah, formalizing hate speech, it's formally defined as a way of communication in which it disparages a person or a group of persons on base of some characteristics like maybe race, color, ethnicity, and gender. So in the present scenario of increasing usage in social media text, we do find a lot of hate speech growing on. But in societies like India, where we don't use a single language for communication, we do code switch a lot whenever we use this language. So to deal this problem of hate speech detection in code mixing language, so this code mixing language generally proposes a new challenges for these NLP tools, because generally in social media text we don't use the complete spelling. There will be spelling variations along the words. There will be shortcuts, abbreviations used in the social media text. Along with the challenges with social media text use, this code switching also imposes much more challenges to identify which language it is. We don't know which language the text is in when the person switches his language. So there are wide research going on in detection of hate speech for English language, which are like just using a dictionary, which are lookup of a dictionary terms of hateful terms, then using simple word-based classifiers to identify what the hate speech looks like, and using deep learning models. So we just wanted to explore this work in English language to our code mixed setting. For this, we have used a couple of baselines for our experiments. One, we have used the extracted character engrams, word engrams, punctuation marks as features. Then we have used SVM classifier and random forest. As we know the feature size might be very large for our data set, we just use chi-square selection to select the best features. So some other deep learning models just to explore in this area. One which is subword level LSTM model. As in the social media text, we have this problem of out of vocabulary words where we generally find spelling variations for many words. We don't get pre-trained embeddings even. So this subword level model, we have, even with the paucity of the data set we can't explore character level models. So we thought to explore this subword level model in which we generate subword representations using a convolution, 1D convolution over the character embeddings, and we assume this particular convolution helps us to achieve the subword representations of those particular words. Then we fed these subword representations directly to LSTM to get the contextual understanding and finally detect them with a label. Going on with the architecture, yeah, this is what which I said, the character embeddings are directly fed with a 1D convolution over this, which we assume this 1D convolutions helps us to understand the subword level representations of those particular words. This particular subword level representations helps us to eliminate problems like spelling variations in the words, and also with the minimal amount of data set we can't employ having character level models. Next, we also wanted to explore hierarchical LSTM model. In the previous model, we allowed neural network to learn the subword level representation. Here, we restrict our model saying that a regex called C plus V plus will be an approximate syllable cutting for my word. So we segment the words into C plus V plus embeddings, which will be called as approximate syllables for the words, and we fed them into LSTMs to understand the contextual representations. So given this particular words, we segment them using C plus V plus as the approximate syllables, and then we fed them to an hierarchical LSTM model to have this classification. So our data set, we collected a data set of 3,800 tweets, in which 2,300 are labeled as hate and 1,500 as non-hate. So we have done pre-processing techniques like generally which we find in tweets, hashtag decomposition, where we break at camel case and removing a hashtag. And we also removed this URLs and user mentions and stop words from the tweet. So a couple of results on this shows that base accuracies of SVM is higher, but the recall and F1s are not promising in that case. Though deep learning models are, given this limit amount of data set, the deep learning models have performed better. So keeping this as future work to see what these embeddings have really learned, what did they really capture? Did they capture something which are related to hate? Can we use those embeddings itself to learn and see what this code mixed patterns contain in that? And also and also in the side of data set, we are also thinking to enhance the data set so that having great amount of data in the context of code switching and in the context of hate speech detection really help for further research. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. Any question?
So you're talking about this pattern C plus V plus.
Yeah.
So do you have an example where you have multiple vowels after consonants? Or should C plus V be sufficient for that pattern? What do you think?
Yeah, might be we can experiment with other patterns and
But
see.
maybe it's a social media text, so there are repetitions of vowels, and that's
Yeah.
what you are trying to
Yeah,
use.
maybe we can see that.
Yeah.
Could you elaborate on using negation words as features?
Yeah, like generally in hate speech, like just countering a person, like just we have experiment with that feature because it might be during a hate speech a person might oppose a person using a negative words, and having a negative segment in hate speech might help us. Yeah.
I have a couple of questions. So do you have any notion of intensity of hate? And second thing is, would your techniques work well even if there is script mixing?
No, right now we have only used a Romanized script of tweets. Like everything is in Roman, only just code mixing either Hindi and English in the Roman script. And so as we are only basing on character embeddings, yeah, might script mixing also help us if we have the character set trained and the data set at a good extent. Yeah, and the other question?
The other question is intensity of hate.
Yeah, no, we just have a classification having either hate or not. Yeah, the regression can be a further approach to see which level the hate has went to. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
So did you face any type of such comments which are more sarcastic in nature rather than directly expressing hate?
Yeah, we do have, like, as this annotation, during the annotation process, yeah, we do have a couple of concerns among the annotators even because we can't, like, there can be sarcasm even embedded. So as it, we just maximize the annotation process here.
So in the
Yeah, we do have that
you-
problem
you
even.
Classified that. Okay. Okay, fine. Let us thank the speaker once again. Oh, sorry. There is one more question, please. Yeah.
Sarcasm, you might be leaving those emotions, right? That may help us to counter the, add the gap between the sarcasm and the real things, right? What I noticed is that you are leaving the emotions data. If you can map the emotions into proper words, that may fill the gap of the sarcasms and other things.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Okay.
So when you collected the tweets, like you have collected a data set and you have crawled up all the tweets. So like in the tweets, there might be a composition of emojis also. Like people use a lot of emoticons.
Yeah,
so how did you like classify the data according? How did you analyze the if it is hate or like what?
No, we have a definition for hate whenever it disparages a person against their gender, caste, so it's termed as hate. So we haven't explored use of emojis in our modeling. Yeah, we do have a plan of exploring.
Okay. Let us give a hand to the speaker. Yeah. The next speaker is Ishani.
Good morning, everyone. So today I'll be going to explain you the problem of co-reference resolution in biomedical text, and I have experimented with some of the entities, and this is a part of the ongoing project at IIT Kharagpur under the supervision of Professor Sudeshna Sarkar and Pawan Goel. So before I start explaining, I would like to throw some light upon the project, which is a entire project, I mean the subpart of which is my problem. So this is a part of drug repurposing through biomedical and literature and patent mining. So I mean when I call it a drug repurposing, it's an application of using some existing approved drugs to some new disease, to treat some new disease. So how can we do that using biomedical literature and patent mining? So once I get the relationships between the potential entities like the disease, the drugs and the targets or the genes and the proteins, then only we'll be able to explain how this problem is going to occur. So the co-reference resolution is a part of this problem where we can extract the entities and then we can demonstrate the relationships between them. So this is the introduction, like co-reference resolution is a task of clustering the entities or grouping the potential entities from a text based on whether they refer to the same real world entity or not. So let us take an example, like here we can see like the interleukin 2 gene expression. It has been abbreviated as IL2. So here you can see the red label proteins, they are the same entities. So they are the co-reference clusters belonging to interleukin 2. So this is a part of noun phrase co-reference resolution. So another part is like the pronomial anaphora resolution. So what is meant by this anaphora? Anaphora is basically when we have a noun mention preceding a pronomial mention. Suppose in layman's term, in general English domain, when we call it like Ram is a good boy and he plays football, here he is indirectly referring to Ram. So he and Ram both are the co-reference clusters, and since Ram is occurring before he, so this is the antecedent and he is the anaphora. So here in this example we can see that and these transactivating factors, they are referring to the same thing. So this is a pronomial anaphora resolution. So coming to the significance of it, so as I was telling you, like co-reference resolution is a subpart of the entire drug repurposing project. So we need to extract the important relations out of it. So here we can take an example, like here the dose of Bistolic must be individualized to the needs of the patient. In patients with moderate hepatic impairment, the recommended initial dose of it is 2.5 milligram. So here EAT and Bistolic, they are referring to the same drug, and the hepatic impairment is a disease. So when we are concatenating these two sentences and we want to extract a meaningful information, so we need that Bistolic is used to treat hepatic impairment and the recommended dose of Bistolic is 2.5 milligram. So here through the anaphora EAT, we are connecting that Bistolic treats hepatic impairment. So the data set that we have considered, right now we have only dealt with the gene and proteins. So this is the BioNLP 2011 shared task data set of protein co-reference. So these are the splits of training, development and test set. These are the abstracts count, abstracts of PubMed or the Medline. So in this data set, we have only considered the anaphoric references. Since the data set consists of only the anaphoric references, particularly to the protein and the gene related expressions. So coming to the primary challenges that we face in the biomedical domain. In the general domain English, we consider the co-reference problem across all the noun phrases. Suppose in a particular document, there are 10 sentences, and in each of the sentences there are might be 4 or 5 noun phrases. But it can be a possibility like only one protein is present in a particular sentence. So we are considering here only the protein and the protein related expressions as our potential entities. So therefore we need a domain specific NER module for the particular task as a pre-processing component. So here you can say in an example like the wild type protein TRF2 and the protein in the last sentence is the mention. So when we are tagging it through a general domain English co-reference resolver, the wild type protein, these two entities are getting linked. While if you are using a domain specific co-reference resolver, the protein is referring to TRF2, which is a correct antecedent. So this is the primary challenge, first primary challenge. Next is the head match feature. It fails and generates a large number of false positives. Here you can see like the cell lines in the first part and the last non-erythroid cell lines, they are completely different. But since the cell lines, the head noun match, it's getting a false positive. And another thing we have a challenge is like the different mentions in a biomedical corpus, like the different noun phrases, they follow a different strategy to resolve. So I am coming to the exactly how we have dealt with that. So when we are seeing the performance comparison between the general domain and the domain specific coreference resolver, we can see the Stanford Core NLP, this is performing quite less. This is giving a very bad performance on the data set. While the bioscores and the reconcile modified, which have been particularly tuned with respect to the biomedical domain, they are performing better. So while the BART, which is a beautiful anaphora resolution tool which was being developed for general domain English and tested on the AC2 corpora, the performance was quite high. So we have proposed some methodology, like we have taken care of both the rules, hand engineered features for machine learning based model. We have ensembled them, and we have extracted out the potential mentions through some domain specific NER, and for the particular mentions we need to extract out the potential candidates. Without the proper candidates, we won't be able to exactly co-refer. And the mention detection has been done with the help of Genia tagger. Some candidate resolution strategies have been adopted, and the mention pair hand engineered features we have used to train SVM and a random forest classifier, and finally we have reported the results. So this is the main pipeline of the model. Like we have first pre-processed the document, entire documents, and through the lemmatization and chunking and the pause tagging, the mention detection and the candidate extraction we have discussed. And in the candidate selection, we have the sentence window of 2, since we have tested in the sentence window model, like as we are increasing the sentence window, the number of noisy candidates are getting increased. So we have filtered them till 2. Now coming to the features that we have taken, like the mention types and the domain specific features of hypernymy, protein content and the protein synonyms, which have been mined from the training set as well as from the crawled from the ontologies of the gene and protein, like the UniProt and the UMLS. So coming to the results, this is the main results part, like where we have tested with SVM and the random forest classifier, and we have seen that the SVM is performing better both for the mention detection and the linking. And without the domain specific features, the performance is quite less, and without the mention type, exact proper mention type feature, the performance is even less. So the error analysis part is like some of the false positives that we can see is like since we have taken care of the adjacency feature, so the false positives are quite high, and this is how the false negatives are also coming. So thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ishani. So some quick questions. Anybody? Yeah, sure.
So this question is probably related to the broader project than your specific thing, but so you mentioned about drug repurposing. I couldn't get that because see the example that you showed, that says biostolic is meant for that particular purpose. So what is repurposing?
So, when I mean through some interactions of drug and since drug acts on the targets like the gene proteins, so it might be possible a particular drug in some literature has reported that this drug is also acting on this particular gene, and which is in turn curing some other molecules, which is in turn affecting the other molecules. So it might be possible like a paracetamol drug can be used to cure headache also. So paracetamol is mainly for fever, like it might be possible through literature mining, through extraction of some important interactions of the molecules, it might be possible that it cures the headache.
Do you mean you would like to invert this, or is so like paracetamol can also be used to cure headache?
No, I am not inferring.
It has to be mentioned somewhere in the literature. or will you claim to be able to infer it?
Yeah, we will be able to infer after we are extracting the relations out and then creating a knowledge graph. From the knowledge graph, we can infer.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, any other question? Coming to that question, please go back to that slide, slide number 3, the diastolic one. Yeah. So see, Ishani, if instead of before that eat, if we have a for there, right? So the recommended initial dose for it is 2.5 mg. Then there comes an ambiguity, isn't it? Then it may be related to for hepatic impairment, or it can be for the drug also, right?
Yeah.
So how do you handle such cases?
So right now we haven't dealt with such cases yet.
Yeah.
Since we have only taken care of proteins right now, we are, I mean, there is no as such protein co-reference annotated data set for disease. So next we are planning to, I mean, we have to hand annotate that through some domain experts. Then we can proceed. Without that, like...
Okay, fine. Okay, let us give a hand to the speaker once again. So the next young researcher was supposed to be Girthana from Anna University, right? But she is unwell. Her professor, who is also a co-author, Professor Swaminathan, is going to present. So please maintain the time. Thank you.
Good morning, one and all. I am Professor Swaminathan from Department of Information Science and Technology, College of Engineering, Gindi campus, Anna University, Chennai. Due to health reason, my scholar, she could not make it. So on behalf of her, I take this opportunity to present this paper. So this is query-oriented extractive summaries, extractive and abstractive summarization. Though it says abstractive, we haven't handled abstractive yet in this work. We have only handled the extractive part. I mean the abstractive part still we are doing on it. So these are all the overall agenda. So what generally a pattern search is, and what is our system, and what kind of domain ontology we have created, then the semantic-based query expansion and pattern document summarization, all that. So as we all know, filing a patent is one of the very important thing that as a academician or as a, part of a corporate this thing culture, we do that. So any novel document has to undergo something called a prior art search. And once the prior art search is okay, then the patent drafter tries to apply for the patent, and then we try to get it. So as of now, though there are some tools available, still it is being done manually by the patent drafter, and they take some reasonable amount of time in order to come up with the prior art search and so on. So we are trying to automate that process. And the basic comparison between the prior art and the text-based web search. So it is more recall oriented. So we would like to have the closer document which is related to our novel document. That is what the recall oriented is. And obviously it has to be a legal technical document. So that is another important thing when you talk about patent prior art search. And so in this work, we try to get multiple patent document related to the novel document that you submit, and we try to come up with a summary of all that that is possible. So for this, this is the overall system. So the novel document, when it is submitted, we try to expand we identify the noun phrase in that, and we try to do some initial query expansion. And we also give it to the Google prior art search kind of thing. And we do something called semantic query expander. So we try to enrich the incoming query by adding the WordNet based query expander. And we also construct what is called a domain ontology for a particular domain. So it's not a generic, and this domain ontology is for a particular domain. And after that, we do the document searching and ranking, and from the document that we have ranked, we try to do what is called the patent summarization, what is called the extractive summarization. So this is what is the overall system. And we have taken a smart device or smartphone as a kind of domain area for constructing our ontology. So we have totally identified around 462 entities, 41 instances and 145 properties, and it is available in the public domain, this domain ontology. And we wouldn't say that it is a full-fledged ontology, but still it is possible to expand it further. So the initial query builder, like if you just consider the prior art search, the entire document is likely to have around 32 pages kind of stuff. So it is very difficult to get all the content from that and then give it to the tool for handling it. So we identify the noun phrases, and these candidate phrases are scored based on the TF, IFF, all that. And then for the initial query, how the for a given document, we have taken a sample document as a novel document, and for that, what is the kind of terms that we get through this query builder using term phrases, and what the Google pattern prior art search query gives all that. And so when you do this, we do what is called the query expander is done at the two level. So the first level is using the domain ontology query expander. So we try to identify the subclasses, all that relevant to a particular keyword, maybe the instance and other concepts associated through that object properties that is associated with the domain ontology. So we try to enrich the query at a first level. In the second level, we also consider the synsets of the same sense, and we try to add more meaningful words to that, and we restrict to some 3 synset of the same sense. And these are all some comparison, like when you give the query term, what is the first level expansion and what is the second level expansion. So ultimately we get an expanded query, so which consists of the terms related to the first level and the second level expansion. And in order to do the actual, multi-document retrieval, we try to take the original pattern document and we convert them into the relevant part, like your title, then abstract, then the technical field, the background, all that. We try to put it in an XML format, and so that it becomes more meaningful when it comes to summarization, all that. And then when it comes to this summarization part, we take the features from the pattern document that we have already identified, and the feature extraction is based on the title similarity, then the search query similarity and sentence field score. We also consider TF, IF, all that, and finally the extracted summary is. And this is how the features are extracted. So we consider TSQ, that is your title and search query similarity. We also take care of the sentence field position, and we also take care of term frequency and inverse field frequency, all that. So based on these features, we use the existing RBM. We have not done anything innovative idea here, but we have just used the existing model. And so based on this, we were able to identify whether to consider a particular sentence or not. And so this gives you an idea of how the feature matrix is correlated with the sentence, and how you get the extractive summary of the overall pattern document that we have provided. And this we have compared with 3 different things. So the conventional Google pattern search, the prior art search query, and how many documents were retrieved for a particular title, and the WordNet based query expansion. So when you give this, how the query get expanded and how many documents you get, and ultimately when you use this domain ontology based query, again what kind of search query expansion you have, and how many total documents you get. So this clearly shows that the more relevant documents are obtained, and we also compared with total rank, we get better results compared to total rank, and that's what our result is. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, so just one question. So there is no abstractive part here.
Yeah, abstractive,
Only
only extractive
only
part
extractive
here.
part here. And for that you require, I think, a separate network, right?
Yes, exactly.
So that has to be done
Yes,
separately,
yes.
right? Yeah. Okay. Okay. Fine. Thank you. Yeah. Bye.
Thank you.
Yeah. So the next.
Good morning. I'm Surabhi and I'm from BTech second year, BTech third year, IIIT Delhi. And this work was done as part of my second year summer internship at IIT Gandhinagar in their cognitive science department under the title of Brain-Computer Interface. So I'll be talking about our approach of emotive stimuli triggered participant-based clustering using a novel split and merge algorithm. I'd like to mention that this is going to be very different from most of the other presentations because our data is not text. We are not doing NLP or any sort of deep learning or convolutional neural networks. Our data here is brain signals that are acquired using EEG setup. So EEG has been very commonly used for measuring brain activity, and that is because EEG is a non-invasive technique. And many researchers claim that it can be used to measure, to judge emotions. But on the other hand, there are also some research which say that it can't be used to measure emotions as well. Instead, you can detect the participants. So we wanted to compare these two contradictory approaches. So we had a comparison on participant-wise categorization to emotion-wise categorization. So this was our methodology. We collected data for 20 participants through movie clips. And then the data was converted to frequency domain and bands were divided, and we used a clustering algorithm and analyzed our results. So we had 20 participants, and they were all MTech and PhD students from IIT Gandhinagar, and they were all around 20 to 28 years of age, so it was a very homogeneous participant set. And the stimuli, as I said, were 9 Bollywood movie clips, and they were all 2 to 3 minutes in duration, and they were meant to elicit a strong emotional response in the participant. So if people have heard of the Navrasas, we aimed that each Bollywood clip is for a particular emotion, one of the 9 emotions like fear, anger, sorrow, laughter, and all of that. And the equipment that we used is the 128 channel geodesic net, which is one of the best equipments in EEG, and their lab could provide us that, so I'm very grateful. And the data collection was that when the participants are watching the stimuli, we collect their brain signals and then analyze that. So pre-processing is one of the major steps when it comes to signal analysis. And like we just heard in the talk, aggregation is commonly used in EEG because it's a time domain, so it just gives you a lot of data. So you have to aggregate it, and converting it to frequency domain allows us to do that. Because we just heard in the talk as well, it converts a local perspective to a global perspective, so we are able to downsample the data. Alongside, we also perform normalizations, and since it was a 128 channel net, you have electrodes near your cheeks and forehead also, and we didn't want to collect data from those regions, so we just collected the internal ring, which could channelize all the signals from the scalp region. So data clustering. Why data clustering? Why not supervised? That is mainly because we wanted to compare what the underlying nature of the data is. We wanted to judge if it's participant-wise or if it's emotion-wise. So, of course, when we don't know the labels to give, you have to opt for an unsupervised learning, because if a participant I is watching a emotional movie J, you can either give label I or label J, right? So we went for an unsupervised method, and here we used K-medoids with Spearman distance. So K-medoids because K-means will not work in signals because you have outliers. And here even a blink of an eye or a nod of a head is an outlier for EEG data. So we went for K-medoids because median is, it does not depend on the distribution. So outliers, it's unaffected by outliers. And Spearman distance, which works well with auto-correlated signals. So the clustering algorithm that we used was a novel split and merge algorithm. That was because we wanted the clusters to be balanced. So we had a splitting and merging technique. In the splitting part, we kept splitting our clusters till all the clusters had at most 20 points. So let's say we have 50 points. We divided into two, 20 and 30. So 20 we won't touch because 20 is the upper limit and it's agreeing to that condition. 30 will further split on till all the clusters that we have an upper limit of 20 points, 20 samples. And then this is setting of the upper limit. We also set a lower limit because we don't want an imbalance. We don't want the 20 points in one cluster and a single point in the other. We might as well include that single point in some other cluster, right? So we had a lower limit as well. So the lower limit was fixed to 5, and any cluster having less than 5 points would be merged to some other cluster having more points. And the value that we chose, 20 and 5, upper limit 20 and 5, they all came out of statistical analysis and plotting of graphs and analyzing which threshold will work the best. So let's move on to the results that we obtained. So we saw that we were able to cluster participants very, very well. So we kind of observed that we found 20 clusters with 9 emotions in each. So we were able to identify participants very well, and these results will indicate that. So the mode cluster number. So in the first one here, this is for emotional wise. So in the first emotion, we have 20 participants, but only 3 of them were put into the same cluster. And whereas if you compare it with the second one here, second graph, for the first participant, all his 9 emotions went into the same cluster. So we were able to cluster participant-wise very well. So even in the confusion matrix, what do we generally want? We want the matrix to have zeros and a few high values at the required spots, right? So in case of emotional wise clustering, we could not observe that. So we had a whole matrix of very, very small values, 1s, 2s, 3s, compared to higher values of 20 that we should have achieved. But in case of the participant wise clustering, we observed that we got the matrix very, very well populated, with 9s and 8s and lots of other zeros. So another very, very interesting observation is that when we observe these graphs for a particular person, all of his 9 waves are very, very similar. But for a particular emotion, the 20 waves of the participants are very, very distinct. So that's why we were able to cluster the participants very well, and hence we conclude by saying that probably in the future, like we have biometric, we have iris scan to like detect people, probably the brain waves and how you respond to emotional content could be your identity and a signature of a person. So it can be used to detect participants in future. Yes, thank you.
Nice talk, Shudovi. Some questions? Yeah.
What will be the influence of the heterogeneous group?
Yeah, so here all the students were from PhD and MTech background, and they were all from the same institute. So that is why we are calling it homogeneous.
What will be the influence of the heterogeneous group?
Yeah, so we have to increase the number of participants for doing that, and from a different diverse background, yes.
Age category you were mentioning?
Yes, it's 20 to 28 years, yeah. Yeah, so in our study, since we were limited to that surrounding, so we had participants only in that age group. But if we have a diverse participants, then probably we may have different results. And also, I would like to mention that if somebody else does a similar study, they can have different results, because EEG data collection is one of the major things. So how you collect your data is going to base a lot of your results on.
Now, one major challenge in EEG, Shudovi, is to segregate your actual data from external electromagnetic influences and even from cardiac signals, which are also electrical signals very close by.
Yes.
So what are the precautions you took to...
Yeah, pre-processing methods, there are a bunch of pre-processing fixed methods that are done on EEG, and we did all of those. Like you have notch filters, you have Butterworth filters, you have median filtering. There are lots of, because when you deal with signals, that is the case, right? Because even in EEG, when you have a signal the nearby signals are going to distort the signal
That is what
a lot.
exactly
Yes.
I told you. Yeah.
So the fixed EEG pre-processing methods, we implemented all of them to like tackle that situation. Yeah.
Any other question? Yeah.
In one of the slides, you were mentioning that some participant had only 3 emotions. I'm sorry if I didn't get it correctly, but were you showing Bollywood clips and how basically what was the validation procedure of the emotion? Because if the clip has a certain emotion, then were all the participants showing, do the 8s and 9s in your matrix mean that all the participants were showing same emotions? And
Yes.
if the number is 3, that means were the rest of the participants not showing the same
No,
emotion?
no, they were all shown the same movie clips, and they were all supposed to elicit a strong emotional character. And we also validated it with the participants, and we had a questionnaire which told them to indicate if you felt this emotion was what it was in a scale of 1 to 9. So that is how we validated if the emotions were actually what they felt they were.
Okay. Let us give a hand to Shudovi and let us move to the next speaker, Kritik. Yeah.
Hello everyone. The topic of the paper that I had submitted is rooftop detection using aerial drone imagery. The idea of this project was essentially that before I had joined IIT Kanpur, there was a startup that had a client who wanted to do this project. So this is not a full-fledged research project. This was an initial idea that we had explored with them for trying to do rooftop detection. So the problem statement is as follows. We are given multi-view drone images from specific regions. And the idea is to be able to detect rooftops first, and then provide an estimate of the area on the rooftops that can be used for installation of solar panels. So we need to predict the available area on rooftops where solar panels can be deployed from the multi-view aerial images. So the semantic segmentation conventionally using in such cases is done by deep learning networks by training on large data set and identifying rooftops using a deep learning model. However, the work that we have done here, we had got very few images to do the task. So we had like 5 or 6 images of different regions, and each of them was a multi-view image. So we proposed an alternative approach where we use simple basic image processing techniques and try to not go into deep learning, but develop a low-cost approach that can be used for a smaller number of data sets. So in this work, we will discuss the approach that we have used and how it performed for the given data set that we had, which had very few regions where we could run this on. So this is the general summary of our approach. We have the drone image, which has the RGB image of the region. Additionally, we also have the DEM, the digital elevation model, which was constructed using photogrammetry. And we also have the IR data. So we have like 5 RGB, the depth, and the IR data of that region to work with. So the first step was pre-processing, where we did some basic interpolation to fill in the missing values. And we also matched the resolution because the resolution of the DEM was different from that of the RGB and the IR segments. So we brought up all of them to the same scale. Then we applied basic segmentation techniques on the DEM so that we could detect segments in the image. The next task was that we needed to identify the rooftop segments. So in order to do this, we employed a feature extraction pipeline where the first task was to determine the ground segments and remove them from these images. So that the ground segments, once you remove, we say that the remaining of them are the potential roof mask segments. So to remove the ground segments, we used some amount of feature extraction, and we used a basic decision tree to detect the ground segments. Once we removed the ground segments, we found a potential roof mask by saying that all the segments that are not ground are rooftops. Once we got potential rooftop segments, we then started to look at how to remove vegetation and other aspects from the digital elevation model, so that these were also not part of rooftops, so we needed to remove them. And finally, we also classified clutter from the rooftop so that the actual usable area for installation of solar panels can be determined. So this is just an illustration of what we had to work with in the beginning. So on the left, you can see the orthophoto, and on the right is the corresponding digital elevation model. So what you can see here is that the idea of this slide is to be able to show the challenges that we had to work with. One of them is that there are vegetation components, so there are trees, and these trees, as is shown in the red square, these have different elevations at different points. So it's difficult to remove these and identify these and remove them because these will actually proved to be a problem in the processing pipeline. The other issue that we faced was that the edges of the rooftops are not very crisp. So you can see that there is blurring at the edges of the rooftop at the lower left corner of the image. This was because the rooftop image that is constructed from the DEM is an approximation from multi-view images. So we needed to find out methods to first sharpen out these edges and then segment the image. So we began with the pre-processing steps of interpolating to take care of missing values, and we downscaled the RGB, the depth, and the IR to bring it to the same scale, which was the scale of the DEM that we knew, because the dataset that they had provided, it was that 5 centimeter is 1 pixel. So we brought everything to the same scale. We started to apply some sharpening operations. So we did blurring the original DEM with a Gaussian filter. We blurred the output again with another Gaussian filter, and we sharpened the resulting DEM by adding the original DEM in the difference to the two blurred images to essentially try to sharpen out the edges. Once we did this sharpening operation, we then ran a simple edge detection operator to isolate the edges. But the problem that we faced in initially doing this without the pre-processing that I was talking about in the previous slide was that these edges that were detected, they were not continuous, and they had discontinuities, they were blurred. So in order to try to fix this issue of discontinuity in edges, we had done this sharpening operation that we have taken care of, described in the previous slide. Once we have done this sharpening, we still miss few edges, so we dilate it and also skeletonize it to finally obtain the sharp edge. Once we have the sharpened edges, we then segment the image and obtain the segments that are detected in the image. Now once, this is what a segmented DEM looks like. So compared to the DEM that I was showing in the first slide, here you can see that the edges are almost clear. There is no blurring of the edges. But now the problem is that the trees have formed multiple segments because the height is different. So we now need to work towards removing the segments that involve vegetation, and we also need to do a couple of other steps that we'll explain as we go to the processing pipeline. So the first task was to identify the ground segments from this image. So for doing that, we constructed a set of features which included convexity defects, the number of holes in the image because these ground segments have large number of holes, and with the number of adjacent segments nearby a ground segment. So we constructed this 6-dimensional feature space and trained a decision tree to detect the ground segments. In doing so, we identified the ground segments, and we said that whatever is not a ground segment is a potential roof mask. The next step was removal of vegetation. So I said all these trees and all that are contributing to false positives. We use the NDVI, normalized differential vegetative index, which uses the ratio of the IR data and the red spectrum of the RGB image. And if you threshold this ratio, you can remove the green vegetative components in the image. A small challenge that we faced here was that sometimes the orthophoto, the rooftops also had grass in them, and we did not want to remove these because these are also potential areas. So for that, we identified these and annotated them to fix using convex approximations to say that since these regions have high entropy, we also use them as rooftops. So this is a result of the work. So on the left is the initial photogrammetry image. What is different here is that you can see that the ground level elevation is also not common across the image using the legend. In the middle is the ground truth, and on the right are the results that we got using our approach. So you can see the precision recall and F1 score are also shown on this slide. The last task here was to also remove the clutter on the rooftops, because we need to provide an estimate of the area that is available on each rooftop where solar panels can be involved. So certain rooftops had clutter, like there were tanks and small objects on the detected segments. So we removed them, and then we computed the resultant area that was shown here. So this concludes the presentation. Any questions are welcome. Just a small comment here is that there is an exhaustive data set that is available in the public domain, which has much more, and LIDAR data also. So this problem can actually be done using, can be incorporated into that to verify it on a larger scale. This was an isolated data set that we worked on.
Yeah, okay, please.
Thank you. Yes. Could you?
What we understood is that you classified the rooftop and others.
Yes.
But after identifying it, how did you come to area conclusion? I mean, how much area it is?
So the scale of the image is known because we have downscaled everything to the same ratio as the DEM. So in the DEM, we know that a pixel is 5 centimeter. So the resultant area is.
Yeah, but one question still remains is that, see, for separating vegetation from concrete, etc., spectral signatures are enough, right? Different concretes and vegetations, they carry different spectral signatures.
Yes.
So there you don't require much image processing actually. But when coming to scales, for example, a large-sized roof and a small-sized roof. Okay, so that is a challenging thing.
Yes.
Because even a geyser or something like that on a large-sized room can be comparable to a small-sized roof, isn't it?
Yes,
so
I
how
agree.
do you tackle that actually?
So in the data set that I had, this we only had small tanks on rooftops which we could segment out, we could separate out and see. But yes, I agree that it could be a challenge for a large data set and it could be explored. We'll have to probably look at techniques to isolate them using different spectroscopic methods. A review would be needed. I'm not very sure how we can address it at this point.
Okay, one quick question, anybody? Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Shommo.
A very good afternoon to one and all present here. Myself Somo Shubhra Ghoshal, a third year undergrad at NIT Durgapur, is here to enlighten you about my ongoing project on travel time prediction of taxis using tensor factorization. So at first, we got to look at what are the major problems in this domain. So one of the most important problem is that many road segments are not traversed by any vehicle in a given time slot. So we don't know what are the major travel time of many road segments. And one most important problem is that you can concatenate it in many ways. Like suppose you are traveling from Howrah station to here, so there are many possible paths. So which one you will choose, that's a major problem. So what our proposed solution is that given a travel time prediction query, we study the congestion patterns around the query path from the historical trajectories, and then the travel time is inferred from there. So what is the aim of the paper? So I told it before only that we study the congestion pattern from the historical trajectories and use that to predict the travel time of the query path. And another important thing is that we need to develop an approach which is robust against missing data, because the data set we used is quite sparse. So we need something which could move against that, means something which could help us to retain the missing values. So a quick look on the data set we used. So it was a Uber data set given by Black Cap pickups in San Francisco. It consisted of about 14,500 pickups, and each trace is spaced about 4 seconds, means except when the car is stationary. So as you can look that it was given like a 4 tuple, like here OI is the origin, which is lat and long, like a 2 tuple, and DI is the destination, TI is the time of the day, means the time slot, and this is the travel time, total travel time taken by the car. So this is the plot. It's quite clumsy, but you can notice that it's quite sparse. So what I have done, I have taken only this portion, this bounded part, mainly to remove the errors. So if you take the bounded part, you will get only 4,250 trips against the 14,500 trips. Now, next is discretization of the data. So why do we need it? Because geocoordinates are quite continuous variables, and it is possible that because of atmospheric effects, they may get distorted. So to improve the signal to noise ratio, we need discretization of the data. And how do we do it? That this is a plot, so we divide this into this kind of grids. And suppose there are 2 GPS datasets in a single grid, we assume it to be at the center only. Now we form the tensor out of it, and we can see that a given point in the tensor, like Aij equal to C, it's represented like what is the travel time for a given road segment in a given trip in a given time slot. So since you saw that the plot was quite sparse, so more than 99% of the values in this tensor are missing. So we need to retain the values. So how do we do it? One of the most common approach to do that is Tucker decomposition. But using only Tucker model is not quite good, because in this case it's quite sparse. So we have improvised this the temporal and spatial data from the dataset, Uber dataset, and inserted this into the tensor to get a more accurate model. So here X is the temporal data, Y is the spatial data. So elaborating it, so X is contains the means how many cars in a particular time slot is traversing a particular grid, and Y contains the similarities between various road segments, like whether they are bidirectional, unidirectional, or how many neighboring road segments are there at the terminals, like these geographical features. So when we insert it, the objective function changes to like this. And I forgot to mention that here, this part, this is the regularization parameter to avoid overfitting. And in this case, this one is the regularization parameter to avoid overfitting. Now, the most important part, and this work is not complete also, because I am working on this, like concatenation of road segments. At first, I told only there could be various methods to concatenate it, depending on the user, that we are, whether you are trying to find the shortest path or the path which do not have congestion, like this, there are various factors. So this is our objective function. Here mu p is the original travel time, and TP1, TP2 means given a query path P, we are decomposing it into small road segments. And TP1, TP2 are the travel time of each and every road segments. So mu p is the original travel time, and you are subtracting, and this is the least squared error function. So our job is to minimize it. So I have taken a simple trajectory concatenation, means this is quite going on this work. So I have taken a simple trajectory concatenation method. So with this, while comparing the methods, like we have these parameters, lambda 1, lambda 2, lambda 3. So for my case, I have taken lambda 1 equal to lambda 2 because these two functions are quite same, and lambda 3 is quite a discrete function. So this is the plot. It's quite clumsy, but you can see it that for this value gives the lowest error, means the lowest mean absolute error. So this value is lambda 1 equal to lambda 2 equal to 0.02 and lambda 3 equal to 0.08. Now coming directly to the results, for this dimension of the cotensor 3 cos 3 cos 3, we get average error in travel time prediction as 3.36 minutes. But if you go on increasing this cotensor, it might decrease, but I was limited by computational resources, so I have to stop at it. Now coming to conclusions, this project mainly deals with the travel time prediction of taxis given a query path, and moves against data sparsity and missing values, and it has a error of 3.36 minutes in journeys of maximum duration of 25 minutes. Future work you can improvise, like features like how would the travel time depend on weather and visibility, and include a more advanced and robust concatenation of road segments. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Somo. Yeah. Any question? The main challenge here is the tackling the data sparsity thing.
Yes,
so apart from tensor factorization, anything else you are
so also
upon?
that concatenation part, means how will concatenate. There may be various paths, like you can see here in Kolkata only, if you are coming from like Howrah station to here, so there could be various paths. So which path you are taking, it depends on the congestion patterns. So one thing we need is the real time data that I didn't have. So if you have those things, then you can solve that part.
When minimum time congestion, I mean, if you have 4 or 5 paths between A to B, out of that, you know that for each path, you know the time computation. Take the one which has the minimum time to reach to
but
the B.
How will you concatenate it? Means there could be various permutations, like na.
Yeah, true. Okay, let us give a hand to Somo and Gitika, please.
Afternoon, I am Gitika. I'm a second year PhD scholar at BITS Pilani. So the objective of my work was to develop an indexing technique for fingerprint databases. I'll start with the introduction to the problem statement, and then I'll discuss my proposed approach and the results that I obtained. So fingerprint has been around for centuries for authentication. It has a number of curves which are known as ridges. So these ridges are unique in every fingerprint, and they are the mainly source of fingerprint recognition. So fingerprint recognition systems can be classified in 2 categories on the basis of the application they are targeted for. The first one being fingerprint verification system. So this
takes one-to-one comparison, because the user claims that I am this person and it gives his fingerprint, and the system checks with only that template that is stored against its identity. But in fingerprint identification systems, there are one-to-many comparisons, because there is some random fingerprint, and the system compares this fingerprint with whole database to establish this identity. So the problem arises because with wide adaptability of fingerprint, there has been a huge increase in the amount of database. So with increase in the number of templates, there has been increase in the number of comparison. So the solution here lies in pre-filtering the gallery, so that the number of comparisons could be reduced and we could increase the performance of the system. So this involves two stages. First one being the indexing. In indexing, we associate every fingerprint of the database with some feature vector that represent its features, and this feature vector conforms to the index of the database. During retrieval, what we do is we extract the feature vector of the query print, and we only compare the query print with the fingerprints that have similar feature vector. So our proposed approach uses directional and spatial information of the minutia points. Ridge endings and ridge bifurcation points are called as minutia. So there are approximately, like on an average, we have 40 minutia points in every fingerprint. So first we have extracted minutia points from the fingerprint, and then we have generated a CGTC vector, that is our feature vector that will be used as an index. So in CGTC vector, we have computed a distance of one minutia point with every other minutia point, and we have applied a Gaussian distribution on that on the minutia points that are lying in its neighborhood. For indexing, what we have done is we have taken the core point of every fingerprint. Core point is a point which is the highest curvature point, that is the center one. So we have rotated our fingerprint such that the core point's orientation becomes parallel to the horizontal. And then we have split our fingerprint in 72 sectors. So this way we can get the sector number and the distance of every minutia point with the core point. So for any minutia point mi, we get mi.s, that is a sector number and mi.d, its distance from the core point. So our index table is represented in a form that the number of columns are sectors and the distance is the rows. So a CGTC vector of a minutia point having mi.s, mi.d will be inserted at this location in the index table. So at a particular location, we'll have multiple CGTC vector corresponding to their fingerprint IDs. So during retrieval, we'll follow the same procedure for the query print as well. We'll extract sector and distance for every minutia, and we will go to this location and we'll extract all the fingerprint IDs that lie there. So for n minutia points, we'll have n candidate list. So after that, we'll be concatenating all the lists, and on the basis of majority voting, we can say that these are the top candidates that can be used for comparison. We have used FVC 2004 database, which has 800 fingerprints from 100 subjects. The performance measures have been hit rate and penetration rate. Hit rate refers to the number of genuine matches that come up against the total number of queries that have been made, and the penetration rate is the amount of database that should be returned for the successful retrieval. So we have got this result. For 100% hit rate, only 8% of the data, 7.86% of the database needs to be retrieved, and for 95% we only have to retrieve 3.5% of the database. So we can conclude that for retrieval, we are only retrieving only like a constant number of candidates. So our retrieval algorithm is constant in nature. This is it. Thank you.
Thank you. So one or two quick questions for Geetika.
volume is quite high. What sort of indexing will you be able to manage with the same kind of indexing?
If the database is large.
Ah.
Yeah, because we are defining the parameters that hit rate and penetration rate. It is in terms of like you are retrieving only a % of the database. So we can say that if we scale up the database, these measures would be sufficient and this technique would work.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. So if there is no other question, let us thank Gitika once again. And the last presentation.
Hi everyone. So we'll be talking about our work titled Leveraging Ontological Knowledge for Neural Language Models. So this is joint work with Monisha at IIT Madras. We're both final year BTech students. So just to like most of the NLP applications just use word vectors these days as basic ingredients because you need good vector representations for all the words. And while there are off-the-shelf models like Google word vectors which are available for a lot of domains, there are sparse domains for which there's not just enough data to train good word vectors. So because word vectors like word-to-vec models and glove vectors are very data hungry, we thought we could devise a few methods which use ontological knowledge, which basically which are basically structures or hierarchies or constraint pairs, which can improve word vectors. And like the experiments that we performed showed that like better performance, faster conversions, and better domain adaptability are a few things which you can achieve if you use the ontological knowledge well. As a quick sanity check to see if you're heading in the right direction, we did something very simple. So there have been a lot of seminal works in 2007 which have shown that the initial parameter configuration of a neural network has a very large impact on what the final converged parameters are. And because neural network is is optimizing a highly non-convex function, weight initialization with a good initial corpus will provide very good word vectors. So what we did was something very simple. We took all the WordNet word definitions. In some sense, this is the minimal corpus that you can get word vectors on because each word appears only once on the left-hand side. And from the results that you can see on the table, you can see that with just using 1/4 of the data, when we use pre-training, we are able to get better performance than when we use the whole of the Wikipedia data for training word vectors. And it's not just that, it's not just faster conversions that can be achieved using pre-training. You can also see that we get unprecedented performance when we use pre-training. Like even if you train on the Wikipedia corpus for a very large time, it'll converge to some suboptimal performance. Naturally, we extended this simple method for domain transfer as well. So we chose a specific domain, in this case a construction domain, because there was a recent corpus which was released along with a lot of evaluation sets. It's very hard to find good evaluation tasks for word vectors. And what we did was we again used WordNet for weight initialization, and then we did some fine tuning on a construction corpus. So the intuition here is that WordNet will kind of fill in like and give word vectors for common sense words, and when you fine tune it on a domain which has very specific lingo or specific, in this case very construction specific words, you will be able to get word vectors for that domain as well. And as you can see, in the same number of epochs, it's giving around 1.2% accuracy improvement, and in around half the number of epochs, it gives like statistically similar performance. Like motivated by how the most naive way of using an ontology gave better performance, we moved on to something called a relation constraint model. Those of you who are familiar with what is called a continuous bag of words model, which is a very famous word-to-vec model, the loss function is on the slide. So the first term in the loss function basically tries to predict the word given 2 times c, the number of context words, c to the left and c to the right. All that a relation constraint model is doing is adding an auxiliary term which is enforcing 2 words which can be called as constraints to be closer. So for example, the words soccer and football, which mean the same thing, can be considered as a constraint word pair. And what the second term is doing is it's maximizing the probability of getting football given soccer. So there's a list of constraint pairs that we feed into the model, and using this as an auxiliary term, we train it along with the continuous bag of words model. So to obtain these constraints, we use this data set called WordNet domain, which is basically the original WordNet which is developed by Princeton, but there's also a topic which is in like all the words are tagged with a topic. So in our case, because we were working with the construction domain, we chose a subtree out of the WordNet tree which is tagged with the word construction. And as you all know, there are synsets in WordNet, so we used those those synonym pairs as constraints, and we fed just 1,000 constraints into the model. And this is just to give you a sense of what the relation constraint model is trying to do. So for words like baseboard and mopboard, which mean the same thing, when we don't use a relation constraint model, the similarities is 0.06, but it's much more when we use our model. And also on unrelated words, the disparity that is required is maintained by our model. So this is just a hand-wavy evaluation. For a more concrete evaluation, we used a classification task which uses these word vectors as basic ingredients. So without going into details, it's just important to realize that better your word embeddings, the better the performance that you're supposed to get. And though the performance improvement is not great, so we could see that using a relation constraint model was giving us like a better performance. So the key thing to note here is that even if you're trying to do domain transfer to a specific domain which does not have any data, but as long as you can come up with specific constraints, a list of constraints that you can work with, by using the WordNet pre-trained initialization word vectors, you can fine tune it to any domain and potentially to domains which don't have any data at all. So all this was leading up to work which we had thought we wanted to do initially. So hierarchies have a lot more information than flat structures. So in this very simple hierarchy that is on the slide, you can see that a surgeon and pediatricians are types of doctors, and nurses and doctors are two professions under medicine. And the key question that we're trying to answer is, can this information which is represented by this tree be incorporated in word embedding models? Because when you're training word embedding models, you don't really have much control over what is being learned. It's highly dependent on the data. And can the word embeddings actually represent these hierarchical linguistic features? Because these are quite useful things to know. So to this end, we've kind of proposed two different models that we are currently working on. So the relation constraint model loss function is what is there in the first point. So this is what I was talking about before. So the intuition that we're trying to use here is that in a hierarchy, the word pairs which are deeper in the hierarchy tend to be more similar to each other than word pairs which are shallower in the hierarchy. So for example, the words doctor and pediatrician will be more similar than the words medical and doctor. So if we can have a function of just three simple features, which is basically the level of the two words and the level of the lowest common subsumer, the LCS. And if you have a function, you can weight different constraints based on this function, and using this weight, you are going to try and enforce this hierarchy structure which is present in the like tree that you're using. And the second model that we propose is called ordinal knowledge constraints. Instead of using hard constraints, you can have inequalities. So for example, in this tree, you can enforce that the similarity of doctor and surgeon is greater than medical and doctor. Again, the intuition is the same. So the deeper the words, the more similar they are. And you can use a simple Lagrangian and get through this. So in conclusion, what we want to say is that in a lot of cases, if you use knowledge correctly, you can use knowledge to substitute data and remove the need of data completely. And something that we realized in the poster session after a lot of discussions was that in industries where there's a lot of lingo and jargon that is being used, even Google's word vectors might not do well because words might be underrepresented in the corpus. And as long as you can come up with a list of constraints which you can churn into the RCA model, you can get better vectors. So there's a few references. Thanks a lot. Any questions?
Thank you, Amit. Any question? Yeah.
So I had a two-part question. The first question is, when you say that you sort of give more importance to things down the tree compared to something higher up, is that sort of naturally encoded within the LCS criteria, or is it something that you explicitly added?
So this is something you'll have to explicitly add because there might be words which are deeper in the hierarchy, which might appear more number of times in the corpus. So when you're using a corpus, you don't really have control over the occurrences of the words. So if you want to encode something like this, you'll have to explicitly.
So LCS doesn't automatically encode this.
No, you'll have to. You'll have to additionally. So the relation constraint model just takes a list of constraints. If you want this kind of structure, you'll have to weight the constraints based on some mechanism.
And second question was, you said that the hierarchical models sort of encode better, more information compared to flat ones. So
Correct.
is there any way that you can quantify, that you have quantified or empirically sort of verified this?
By quantified, you mean like an example?
Yeah. As in, have you like compared it with another flat sort of corpus and then compared it with this? So
no. So like experimental evaluation, no. So this is work under progress. So we are still doing it right now. But the idea is you will get tight clusters when you're creating word vectors. You expect tight clusters where each cluster belongs to a topic, and this hierarchical structure will mean that there's one representative word for each cluster, and then you can further break down each cluster into multiple clusters. That's the idea that we're looking at.
Okay, thanks.
Just one more question. Anybody?
Yep.
So when you deal with the hierarchical structures, so how are you capturing the siblings, like information about the siblings?
Okay, that's a great question. So again, because WordNet is so rich, there are a lot of different constraints possible. One is a synonym, one is hyponym, one is hypernym. You can use loads of constraints. So this I feel something is dependent on how you would want to use the ontology in your application. In our case, we use synonyms as an example, but it's quite straightforward, as you can see, to just extend it to hypernym or sibling. And there might be applications where sibling relationships are more important. So depending on the domain, you can quite easily extract those and add it to your constraint pair. So it's just a matter of changing the corpus a little bit.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, thanks.
So we have managed to complete it right in time. Thanks to everybody, very nice presentations. Let us give a big hand to all the young researchers and for a nice interaction also amongst us. Thank you. Thank you.
Of the conference. So it's my pleasure to welcome Krishna Gummadi. Krishna is a tenured faculty member and head of the Network Systems Research Group at MPI, Max Planck Institute in Germany. He also holds an honorary professorship at the University of Saarland. He received his BTech from IIT Madras, that was in 2000, and PhD from University of Washington, where I also happen to be from the same place. I'll say a little bit more about that. And Krishna's research interests lie in a diverse set of areas, including measurement analysis, design, and evaluation of complex internet scale systems. His work on online social networks and internet access networks has received wide publicity in media. He has a number of papers which have been widely cited. He has also co-chaired several top conferences, including AAAI's ISA-WSM, IW3C2, WWW 2015, and so on and so forth. He received a grant on investigating foundations of fair social computing recently. That is what he's going to talk about. I remember at UW, he was a couple of years senior to me. We used to look up to him, someone who is very well, in research, doing very well. But from there to someone who is extremely well known globally, I'm really glad to welcome Krishna today. Thank you.
Thank you, Parag. Thank you. Hopefully I can live up to the applause. So I'm going to talk about human perceptions of fairness in algorithmic decision making. So let me start off by telling you what I even mean by algorithmic decision making. Can we just turn this one off? By this, I'm referring to actually data-driven decision making, where we learn from data about past decision outcomes. Now, this is a type of decision making that is increasingly affecting every aspect of our lives as algorithmic decision making is deployed in a number of different systems that we use every day. For instance, if you look at search, recommender, and reputation algorithms, they're extremely influential on social media sites, where they end up determining what type of information you see, who you are going to meet, what types of opinions you hold, and so on. They end up essentially mediating the social discourse, determining whose information you get to see. And these algorithms are also increasingly used on crowdfunding and crowdsourcing sites, as well as sites where you end up like Uber and Airbnb and Kickstarter, where you end up matching riders to drivers, entrepreneurs to venture capitalists, and so on. And finally, there is an increasing use of prediction analytics, where you have algorithms that are being used today to predict where a crime might happen next, who is likely to offend, who might be an employee who is likely to leave your organization soon, who might be a child who is at risk of injuring themselves, and as well as who is the person that is more likely to default. This is in the case of credit risk assessments and so on. Now, as algorithms are increasingly influencing and affecting some very critical aspects of our daily lives, naturally, recently there have been a number of concerns about the fairness of these algorithms. And these range from concerns about discrimination in predictive risk analytics. So this, what I'm showing here, is a headline of an article that was written by ProPublica, which is accusing a software that is used across the country, and the country they're referring to is the US, to predict future criminals is actually biased against blacks. And furthermore, there are concerns about the opacity or the lack of transparency about what type of data is being gathered about people and how the data is being used to actually make these decisions. This has led to popular books like Weapons of Math Destruction and The Black Box Society and so on. Furthermore, there are also increasingly growing concerns about implicit biases in search and recommender systems, where there is a fear that these algorithms on social media sites like YouTube may be trapping people in filter bubbles, exposing them to opinions that they agree with, and in the process, potentially making them more extremist in their ideologies. Now, all these sorts of concerns has spawned a lot of recent interest and research on the topic of algorithmic fairness, particularly in the last 2-3 years. There has been an explosion of interest as well as papers in this field. And in fact, there is a conference that started last year that actually is about fairness, accountability, and transparency. And if you guys are more broadly interested in this topic beyond the narrow silver of this research that I'm going to cover, that I'm going to talk about, I would encourage you to check out the FatStar conference from the proceedings from that last year. Now, in this talk, I'm going to focus mostly on works that are centered around discrimination. Now, discrimination is actually a very, very specific type of unfairness, and it doesn't cover all types of unfairness. And this is a very important point to remember. For instance, if you're making decisions randomly, without considering any features of any user in your system, you might be making decisions non-discriminatory. But that doesn't mean that you're being unfair. In fact, you're being really unfair because you're treating everybody the same. Now, discrimination is a topic that has been extremely well studied in social sciences, like political science, moral philosophy, economics, and law. Majority of countries have anti-discrimination laws. But it has been less studied from a computational perspective. And in fact, in the initial portion of the talk, I'm going to actually make a case for why it is important for computer scientists to get involved in this debate and what the advantages of computational perspectives on this topic might be. Now, before I do that, let me start off by defining discrimination, because it is a very, very specific thing. And here is a sort of a first approximate normative definition of discrimination as is studied in social sciences. So this is a definition that we picked up from Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Roughly speaking, discrimination occurs when you wrongfully impose a relative disadvantage on persons based on their membership in some salient social group. Now, hopefully, most of you feel okay with this definition. The tricky challenge, however, is actually how do we operationalize this definition? Now, what do I mean by operationalization? And this is a concept that is very important to understand. Operationalization is about how do we make this definition clearly distinguishable and measurable and understandable in terms of empirical observations. Now, what this means is that we have to actually operationalize 4 fuzzy notions in that definition. That definition is in English. And so different people might have different interpretations of the words in there. So for instance, what actually constitutes a relative disadvantage? What constitutes a wrongful imposition? What constitutes based on? And what constitutes a salient social group? Now, a lot of work that people have done in this space has focused on how to operationalize all these different terms. Now, I don't have enough time to actually go through a very, very formal treatment of all these 4 different notions, but instead I'm going to explain what people have done by taking a very concrete case study. So let's take the case of recidivism risk prediction. Now, this is a lot of work in this space is inspired by this tool called Compass, which is a tool for predicting recidivism risk. It's a tool that is built by Northpoint, a commercial company in the US. And what it does is it estimates the likelihood of a criminal reoffending in the future. Recidivism risk is the likelihood that someone would reoffend. And the way it does this estimate is by taking as input the answers that defendants provide to a very long questionnaire. And the output are essentially meant as advisories for how likely somebody is to reoffend. And these kinds of advisories are being used by judges in several US states, as well as parole officers, to determine whether somebody should be granted parole or not. So this is a tool whose advisory is actually affecting people's lives in a substantial and significant manner. Now, this has been trained over big data. So the tool itself has been trained over a large amount of historical data about criminals who have been let go in the past and who have been set free and who have reoffended and who haven't. Now, in the training process, they deliberately excluded sensitive feature information like gender and race because they didn't want to be discriminatory along these things. So their idea of being non-discriminatory was to take the data but strip out the gender and race information but train the predictor over using the other features. Now, the goal of Compass was actually very noble. The designers wanted to reform the criminal justice system in the US, which has been shown in several studies to be racially biased. And this is because often you have human judges and they are known to be making biased decisions. In fact, there are studies that show that the way judges make decisions before lunch and after lunch is actually quite different, statistically significant differences. So the idea was to actually nudge the subjective human decision makers with objective algorithmic predictions. And the hope is that because algorithms have no pre-existing biases, because they're just looking at data and they're learning from the data, they would simply process the information in a very consistent manner, and therefore everything would be much better. Now, so what they did was they tried to train a predictor without using information like race. And their hope was that in the process, blacks and whites with the same features would get the same outcomes because you no longer have the race information. And this is what is known as disparate treatment. Disparity is about inequality in treatment. And because a black person and a white person with the same features would get the same outcome, there is no disparate treatment, and therefore it's going to be non-discriminatory. And this was an argument that they made, and it seemed like a pretty convincing argument, and in fact the tool actually got deployed and started being used. And then a couple of years after the tool has been in use, an investigative journalism organization called ProPublica wanted to test this claim. So they wanted to see whether the tool was actually being non-discriminatory. So what they did was they gathered some data about defendants in a county in Florida called Broward County. And what they did was they separated out the black defendants and the white defendants, and they created a confusion matrix where along the columns are the predictions made by the tool. So there are people who are put under high-risk category and the low-risk category, and along the rows are the actual ground truth about whether these people have actually recidivated or not. That means whether they have reoffended or not in the 2 years after the prediction was made. So this is a standard confusion matrix. So the numbers in the green show the predictions that are actually accurate, and the numbers in the red are the ones that are inaccurate. Now, from this confusion matrix, they simply computed what are known as false positive rates for blacks and whites, and then false negative rates, once again for blacks and whites. And this is a standard computations. And then what they noticed was the false positive rates and the false negative rates were considerably worse for blacks than for whites. Notice that in this particular case, having a high false positive rate is worse, and having a low false negative rate is also worse, right? And along both directions, blacks were doing much worse than whites. And this is what led ProPublica to point out that there is a discriminatory, there is disparity in error rates between the two different groups. And this disparity is what we called as disparate mistreatment. And this is what led to that article that I showed you before. Now, when this article came out, this became an example of how algorithms lack ethics at best, or at worst, it has become an example of how algorithmic decision-making is increasingly being used to reinforce existing societal biases, and that one should fear algorithmic decision-making. And in fact, in response to some of these articles, the tool actually was banned from being used in a couple of states in the US. Now, the question for us, however, is why did Compass Classifier actually show this high racial disparity in false positive and false negative rates? After all, it was trained without having any access or being blind to the race information. How did this algorithm actually pick up this form of bias? Who taught this bias? And that's the question that we're interested in looking at. To understand this, let's actually look at how Compass actually learned who recidivates. And this is like machine learning 101, so I'm just going to go very quickly over it. There's nothing fancy here. They learned by training over data about past outcomes. So you have some information about defendants, various different features about them, and then you're trying to build a binary classifier predicting whether somebody is likely to recidivate or would stay clean. This is high risk or low risk. So the challenge is to learn a decision function over the features that separate these two classes of people. Now, what Compass did was they actually trained, they tried to find the optimal decision boundary in the feature space. I'm just showing two features here. The ticks are the people who recidivated, and the crosses are the people who did not recidivate. And what Compass was trying to do was actually find the most optimal or the most accurate linear boundary separating the two classes. So Compass was not some deep learning based tool. It is a simple linear regression based classifier. So now let's actually carefully observe what Compass is actually trying to compute. This is like going back and looking at something that we use every single day, but a little bit more carefully. So when you're learning or computing the optimal boundary, today what we often do is we define and optimize for a loss or accuracy function. Now, this loss function is supposed to capture the inaccuracy in individual predictions. Now, one of the things that we do without even thinking for a second in every day when we use machine learning models is we try to minimize the loss over all examples in the training data. So we have a loss function, like in this particular case, a least squared loss, and then that captures the loss for individual predictions, and we try to minimize the sum of the losses for all the points in the training data. This is something that we don't even think for a second about. And then, of course, oftentimes the loss functions that we pick are the ones that we would want them to allow for efficient optimization. And so in practice, we end up using convex optimization, convex functions, because they allow for easy optimization. So how did Compass pick or find the most accurate linear boundary? Well, they simply optimized one of these least squared loss functions. Now, observe carefully this most accurate linear boundary. In this picture, you can see that the boundary that I drew is actually doing a pretty good job of being accurate, of separating out the ticks from the crosses. But now, let me reveal the information about the race of these points that I did not show here. So what I'm showing now is the race of these points. Some of the points, there is a people belonging to the yellow group, and then there are people belonging to the blue group. Now look at what happened with this most optimal classifier. It actually makes very few errors for yellow, and it makes lots of errors for blue. Worse, the error that it makes for yellow points are actually false negatives, whereas the errors it is making for blue points are false positives. So what happened? In fact, this should not have been surprising at all, because when we trained the learning algorithm, we tried to make the most accurate predictions across all the points in the training data, right? Like across the global population. So it shouldn't be actually very surprising at all that in the process it might have traded off more errors for one subgroup of the population for fewer errors for the other subgroup of the population. And this is exactly what leads to disparate mistreatment or inaccuracy in error rate. So in some sense, what we try to optimize is for minimizing the sum of individual error rates, whereas when we think of discrimination, we're talking about error rates at the level of groups. Notice that this algorithm still follows disparate treatment. That means if you flip the color of any dot, it would still get the same treatment. So it's still the case that in this particular boundary, if a yellow dot were a blue dot, if a person of yellow race were of blue race, they would get the same treatment. So the cause of error rate disparity is actually because the objective that we went for is minimizing the sum of individual error rates. That is, we wanted to minimize the probability of the predicted value not being the same as a true value for all the points, which clearly doesn't guarantee equal average group error rates. And so when you think about average group error rates, you could think of overall error rates, or you could think of false positive rate or false negative rate. Now what I'm showing here is the requirements of equality of group error rates, the probability that, that the error rates conditioned on the race of a person being black or white being the same. Okay? So how do we learn to avoid discrimination? It's actually ridiculously simple. All that you have to do is specify the discrimination measures as learning constraints. And what we mean by this is, traditionally, we're going to optimize for accuracy over all the data points. That means we try to minimize the error or the probability that the predictions are the same as the ground truth. Whereas now we add an additional constraint because now we have multiple objectives. Our objective is not just to minimize the overall individual error rate, but also to equalize the group error rate. Now, notice that by adding these constraints, what we have done is we are adding, in some sense, ethics or values in the learning process. Now, notice that there is no free lunch. Anytime you add an additional constraint, you're going to lower the performance with respect to your original objective. So whenever you add a group error rate equality constraint, you're going to lower the accuracy. So there is a trade-off between accuracy or performance and ethics. Now notice also that in this constraint that I put down here, you need race information. That means if you actually want to train a classifier that is non-discriminatory in terms of the error rates, you actually need the race information during the training process. You might not need it in the deployment process, but in the training process, you actually need it. So in that sense, the direction in which the Compass designers went was actually the wrong one to begin with. They should have gathered the information about the races and used it during the training process, even if they didn't use it in the deployment stage. Now, the technical challenge is how do we learn efficiently under these constraints? That means how do we minimize the prediction errors, overall prediction errors for all, subject to equality of error rates? Now, the problem is this one is not a convex formulation. In fact, it's something very similar. In fact, in machine learning, always we try to use convex loss functions as proxies for the actual losses. So nobody tries to minimize, for instance, the probability of the predictions not being true as not being same as the true. In fact, when we use least squared loss function, that's a proxy for the empirical loss or risk that we would like to minimize. So we need to do something similar. We need to replace or rewrite these constraints in such a manner that they can be efficiently learned. Now, I'm going to very quickly talk about the key insight here. And in fact, this is actually fairly straightforward insight. Now, how do we rewrite the constraint so that it actually leads to a convex or some sort of an optimization problem that we could efficiently solve? So to rewrite it, the basic idea is similar to the ones in SVM and all the other margin-based classifiers. The idea is rather than insist that the probability or the error rates for the two groups are the same, we actually want to make sure that the average misclassification distance from the boundary for both groups should be the same. That means we take all the points that are misclassified, the yellow points and the blue points, and we look at their average distance from the boundary for the points that are misclassified, and then we want that average distance to be the same. Now, the reason why we do this is because if you look at the average distance or the distance from the decision boundary, that is a convex, or it's a concave function. And so when you rewrite the mistreatment constraints, it ends up being something like this. Now, notice that I made two small changes. The first is, instead of actually equalizing the two error rates, I'm actually subtracting the two, I'm taking the difference between the error rates, and I'm actually bounding them by some threshold epsilon. Now, this is some tunable knob that you can use. If you make the epsilon 0, that means you're expecting perfect equality. But oftentimes, if you demand perfect equality, the problem might even be, there may not be a feasible solution. So in practice, you might actually want to have some leeway, and therefore, instead of demanding perfect equality, I'm taking the difference in the error rates and I'm bounding it by epsilon. And that's the role of epsilon. And the second thing that I did is I just simply replaced the probabilities of which are capturing the error rates with these concave loss functions. Now, the problem formulated this way can actually be solved efficiently. And this is because of some fantastic work done by people at Stanford, Stephen Boyd's group, where they came up with these techniques that can be used to solve convex-concave programming. Notice that this formulation that we have is not exactly a convex formulation because it's the difference between two concave functions. So it's actually a convex-concave constraint. But luckily for us, there are some really smart people who have figured out efficient algorithms for solving this, and we just use them to solve this problem. Now, just to give you a very high-level overview of whether these constraints actually work in practice, let me show some simple evaluation that we did. So we took some recidivism history data set that was gathered by ProPublica, the organization that did the investigative journalism article on the Compass tool. And we had a bunch of features in the data set. And the class label that we were trying to predict is a 2-year recidivism rate. So first, we trained traditional logistic regression classifier without any constraints. And the accuracy that we got was 67%. Notice that this is not the actual accuracy of the Compass tool. We don't know that because that's a black box to us. We're just imitating the design of the Compass here. And the false positive rate, the disparity in the false positive rates is 20 percentage points in favor of whites. And in terms of false negative rate, the whites had 30 percentage points lower false negative rate. So there is clearly disparity. So the traditional classifiers are actually causing disparate mistreatment. Now then, we applied our fairness constraints and we retrained the classifier. Now with this, we actually managed to decrease the disparity in false positive rates from 20 percentage points to 3, and the false negative rate from 30 to 11. Notice that we didn't achieve perfect equality, because there are actually some very interesting results showing that in certain data sets, achieving perfect equality is actually infeasible. There are some impossibility results here as well. But as a practical matter, we did manage to decrease it significantly. Now, in the process, if you look at, we did take a hit in terms of accuracy. Now, this number is might be a little bit deceiving, because in this particular data set, we got super lucky, and the amount of accuracy hit that we took was just 1%. But there is no theoretical reason why this should happen. You could well end up having data sets where the decrease in accuracy that you have is significantly higher than what we observed. But this is just as a proof of concept to show that these sorts of fairness constraints can actually work. Now, at this point, let me just step back and give a bit more of an overview of other types of work that were done by us and others about operationalizing discrimination. Notice that I actually already spoke about two different operationalizations. One is disparate treatment, and another is disparate mistreatment. Okay? Now, are these two operationalizations sufficient, or is there a need for using different when I'm saying operationalization, you remember the definition of, the English definition of discrimination? I'm talking about like how do you formally translate it into kind of thing. Now, are they sufficient for all scenarios? The answer is no. In fact, just talking about our work in the space, there are a lot more than what we did. We ourselves came up with 3 other interpretations or operationalizations of the discrimination definition to cover different kinds of scenarios. First, notice that in fact, I should have emphasized this before. Notice that in the discussion so far, I always assumed that the training data is completely unbiased. Notice that the problem with inequality in error rates did not come because the training data was biased in any way. But if the training data were to be biased, then requiring disparate mistreatment or equalizing error rates might actually be the wrong thing to do, because then you would actually be confirming the biases that are already in the training data. In that situation, you might want to require a different type of equality, which is the equality of acceptance rates, not error rates. That means what fraction of people from one group got selected versus what fraction of all members of the other group got selected. But this would, of course, require you to rewrite the fairness constraints in a very different manner. Then there may be situations where if you required equality of error rates for all the different groups, the only feasible solution might be one where everybody is worse off. Now, this is something that can actually occur in practice. In fact, we do show that there are some data sets where if you required equality of error rates for all the different groups, the overall error rates for both groups might actually increase. Now, in those situations, it does make sense to actually, and the reason why this happens is because the requiring parity in outcomes is actually a non-Pareto optimal solution. And so you could actually rewrite the fairness constraints in such a manner where you say, require equality, but you allow inequality in error rates only when both groups actually get error rates that are better than what they would have gotten in the counterfactual scenario where you actually demand equality of error rates. If that is a little confusing, please check out our NIPS paper because it takes a while to get your head around that notion. Then one question that some of you might be thinking about is, why are we not actually solving this problem by simply picking group conditional boundaries? Why not have separate boundaries for the blue dots and the yellow dots? We would be done with this. The problem is, if you start using different boundaries for the two different groups, you would be accused of what is known as reverse discrimination. Reverse discrimination is one where some people feel that the other group, because they have a separate boundary, it's like it begins to be thought of more as a quota system, and there are issues with that sort of a thing. However, if you think about this logically, there are certain situations where actually having group conditional boundaries can be justified. And those are situations where if you can assure each group that the boundary that they have is something that they would prefer over the boundary that existed for another group. That means when the boundaries that you pick for both the groups are what are known as envy-free, then in such a situation, you can actually break out or break free from this argument of reverse discrimination, because now, even though you have two separate boundaries for the two groups, each group knows that if they use the boundary of the other group, fewer of them would actually get selected. Once again, these are notions that can be formally can be formulated in a formal manner, and they can be trained for. So let me now step back and draw some quick higher level lessons from the Compass story. And this is something that took me a long time to realize, and this is about what's the highest level insight about ethics and learning. I think the insight is that learning objectives implicitly embody ethics. In terms of the way we actually trade off between the different types of decision errors. Now, one of the mistakes that I think machine learning researchers often do is they think that the traditional objective accuracy is somehow very objective. But if you actually think about it, accuracy is a social choice, the way we define it. The reason is, if you actually talk to philosophers, and particularly moral philosophers, or you read the works of Amartya Sen, you would actually realize that what we're actually talking about is very, very utilitarian ethics. Because what we are saying is the righteousness of a decision, of decisions, is actually a function of individual utilities, that is individual errors, and that the desired function is the one that maximizes sum of all the individual utilities. Whereas when you make decisions for a group of people, you might well decide that the right thing is not just is not the function that actually maximizes the sum of utilities of the decisions that you made to all the people, but why not look at something like inequalities in the utilities that you give to all the people? Or why not look at the worst off person? That means why not minimize the maximum error that you cause for any person in the training data? Now, there are lots of scenarios where utilitarian ethics actually fall short. And in those situations, you might want to actually change your learning objective to account for these ethical considerations. In fact, non-discrimination requiring equalizing group error rates is one such an example, where you want to optimize for the overall performance or overall accuracy, but it's just one way of, one of many different objectives that you would have for learning. Now, at this point, I'm going to now switch gears, because what I've described so far is largely the work that is done in the recent years. And now I'm going to ask the question, are we done? Is fair learning all about specifying and optimizing the right learning objectives? That means you figure out like what are all the different things that you would want, and is that all, or is there more to it? Now, before I go on further, I can take a quick question if someone has one. Go ahead.
The idea of using non-discriminatory variables discriminatory variables for building non-discriminatory models was very intriguing. But I was wondering that do you consider the practicality of it? But because there are many regulations where it says that you cannot build models using this race and gender such information. For example, in financial services, you cannot build like loan approval models and things
Yes.
like that.
So the question is, like, so that's true, but the question is, do the people who pass these regulations understand the implications of it, right? And this is a serious point. I was mentioning to people just the other day, I heard about some regulations that people passed for e-commerce sites. And there is some terminology in these regulations that's always in English that says Amazon and Flipkart or whatever would need to offer a level playing field for all the vendors, and that they should do these things in fair and non-discriminatory manner. And these articles were questioning, but what exactly constitutes fair and non-discriminatory? These things have to be defined. The measures have to be defined. And this is a work of academic scholars who would actually think about and debate these sorts of things and then figure out what the trade-offs are, right? And presumably when people recognize the complexity or the nuances of these issues, because notice that even for race information, I was talking about using it in the training process, but not in deployment, because the decision function itself is still independent of it. So these are things that are worth discussing. I'll take one more question and then I will move on. Yes.
So you talked about this race to recessive. They had an imbalance in their number, large imbalance. So do you foresee a new challenge to come in the way you are attacking this problem?
So the problem that I was, the inequality in error rates is it's true that it's likely to occur particularly more, or is more likely to manifest when the fraction of people belonging to the different races is very different. But in general, in theory, it could manifest even if they are in equal proportion. There is nothing that would say this problem wouldn't arise in those situations. But it's true that when there is a big imbalance, it matters more. Yes.
So do you need to take anything additional?
No,
like
not
the way
in the way we formulate it.
Class imbalance in a traditional thing. Do you need to do something like that? Yes.
So there are some solutions that go in that direction where they say, why don't we sample more from the minority class so that we account for this? And that's an interesting idea, but the question is, if you look at how I was making the argument, I see a particular way of reasoning about this where we're insisting that the error rates be the same. And we're not, in our formulation, we're not actually doing any resampling of the data. But there are these methods, and understanding the differences between the different methods and which one is more appealing is still an open problem. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to move on because now what I'm actually going to talk about is some work that we started doing more recently, and this is less well-baked than the works that I presented so far. But to me, these are some questions that we're still wrestling with. So the problem that the whole thing came about when we did all this work, and then we started asking ourselves, how do we actually determine the fairness of a decision-making system? Now, a decision-making system largely has, you could think of it as having three components. You have the inputs, and then you have the actual algorithm or the model that is working on the inputs and is producing the outputs. Now, how do you determine whether this decision-making system is fair or not? Now, if you look at all the work that we have done so far, there are actually two major limitations of them. The first one is we always were talking about the fairness of the decision outcomes. Notice that we were only talking about the objectives of the decision-making system, and all our fairness constraints were about whether the outcomes satisfy a certain property. We didn't actually talk that much about whether the process of making decisions is fair. Now, we did talk just a little bit insofar as pointing out that it's wrong to use sensitive features in deployment phase, but it's okay to use sensitive features during training phase. But beyond that, we haven't actually talked much about whether what actually is the right way to think about using a feature. So for instance, one of the features of Compass that gave us a good pause was juvenile criminal history. So one of the features that is used to predict them is whether somebody committed certain criminal acts when they were kids. Now, the question is it fair to use the feature? I don't know how you guys feel about it, but at least some of you might think that there is something iffy about using the juvenile criminal history for predicting this thing. But then this by itself is actually not captured by the anti-discrimination laws, because a juvenile criminal history is not a sensitive feature. But why are we feeling that there is something unfair about it, and how do we capture our feelings of unfairness here? And the point here to recognize is that most of the works that were done so far focused on what is known as distributive fairness, or the fairness of the outcomes or the ends of decision making, but not about procedural fairness or the process of decision making. So the question then comes up, like, how do we determine if a feature is fair to use, which is sort of a notion of procedural fairness, or a question that matters in procedural fairness. Now, even here, if you look at how people think about ethics, there are two broad classes of ways of thinking about ethics. One is called as the normative approach, and the other is called the descriptive approach. Now, in normative approach, what you do is you stand up and you say, I am the authority, or I am the parliament, and I'm going to prescribe how fair decisions ought to be made. I am the regulator, and I'm going to say what is fair or what is not fair. And that's the normative approach. You prescribe the decision-making process. And anti-discrimination laws are an example of the normative approach, and they essentially prohibit the use of sensitive features. Then there is another form of ethics, which is called the descriptive ethics, where what you do is actually you study how people feel about the fairness of a decision-making process. So this allows us to go beyond discrimination. For instance, one of the features that is used in the prediction of, that could be used in the prediction of Compass is parents' criminal history. Now, how do we feel about that? It might well be possible that your parents' criminal history might have a causal relationship with your criminal history. But just because it is causal, are we comfortable with it? And if we are not, how do we account for it? And how do we think about these things? And similarly, for instance, your employment status is another question on the questionnaire. So, in fact, let me quickly show you what are the types of questions that Compass asked the defendants. Now, a disclaimer, not all of these, they actually claim that they didn't use all the features that they gathered data about, but it is a fact that they actually got all this data about all the defendants. They asked over 130 questions, and there are about 10 different topics. And these topics include current criminal charges, understandable, criminal history, substance abuse, whether somebody is doing drugs and heroin, stability of employment, criminal attitudes, they ask questions to the defendants of the form. Would you steal if you were hungry? And personality questions. They would ask people like, do you feel, or the thing, I think it's the quality of social life. It includes questions of the form, how many friends do you have? Those sorts of things. And then they have a feature, they have questions about neighborhood safety. They would ask the defendants where they were living, and they would look at the criminality or the crime in that neighborhood. And these are all potentially features that could be used for prediction, but they're not sensitive. And the question is it fair to use all these features to make bail decisions? Now, what we wanted to do was to actually gather human moral judgment. And so what we did was we surveyed respondents from the US, because this is a US legal system that we're talking about. And we did this by actually recruiting people over Amazon Mechanical Turk, as well as a survey company called SSI, which actually gave us a census representative sample of respondents. And the findings that we had that I'm going to present are consistent across both the samples. So let's start with the first one, which is human judgment of fairness. So what features do people consider fair to use in our survey? So here are the 10 different topics that along the x-axis. And along the y-axis, the mean fairness of the responses of the people that was on a Likert scale, so 1 to 7. So the number 4 means that that's the place where people are not sure whether it is fair or unfair. 7 means that they think that the usage of the feature is fair. 1 means that they consider that as unfair. Now, if you look at the median bar, which is the bar that indicates that people are unsure about the fairness, in our survey, a majority of the features that Compass is gathering data about are rated as unfair to use. Now, furthermore, it's not just that people thought that a lot of these features were unfair. There was considerable disagreement amongst the people about the use of these features. So for instance, what I'm showing here, once again along the x-axis, are the 10 different topics. And along y-axis is the agreement. And the agreement is something that we measured as Shannon entropy, normalized Shannon entropy. This is like because people give responses from 1 to 7. An agreement of 1 means that everybody is agreeing that it is fair to use, and 0 means that it is quite unfair to use. Now, once again, on a certain topics like current charges and criminal history, people actually agree about the fairness of using it, but along the other things, there is significant disagreement. So the question then becomes, what factors actually drive human judgments, and why do they actually disagree? Now, the hypothesis that we had was that when people are making these judgments, and this is something that that we thought through ourselves as well as looked at some social sciences literature, that people often implicitly assess some latent properties of the features. And these are properties like, is the feature relevant for the decision-making scenario? Can one assess the feature reliably? Like for instance, asking the question, would you steal if you're hungry? It seems like a very bizarre question. You might answer it in lots of different ways. It's very unclear what it is reliably assessing. And another consideration is the volitionality of the feature. That is this a feature that you have control over? For instance, the reason why you might feel uncomfortable about your friend's criminal history affecting your predictions about your future is because that's not what you're choosing. Then there are questions about privacy. And then there are all these questions about causality, like does the feature actually cause the outcome? And is it possible that the feature might cause a vicious cycle? So for instance, people sometimes feel that even if your friend's criminal history is a good causal predictor of your criminality, it might be a wrong thing to use because it might end up creating a vicious cycle where if you have more friends who are criminals, you go to the jail more, and then you make more friends who are more criminals, and then it creates a vicious cycle. And these are things that people implicitly think through. And then the two other things are the ones that are related to discrimination. Does it actually cause disparity in outcomes for the different races? And is it caused by sensitive group membership? Now, our hypothesis is that people somehow implicitly or intuitively assess these, and then in the step 2, based on their latent property assessments, they would actually map these things to the fairness thing. So you implicitly, whenever you're shown a feature, you think about these things, and then you say, based on what your thoughts are, you would map it to the fairness. So we wanted to test this hypothesis, and we wanted to see whether or not people are actually following these forms of reasoning. So what we then did was we actually asked people why they thought some feature was unfair to use. Of course, we offered them all these choices of these features that we came up with. Again, the list is not necessarily exhaustive, so we even left another option for others, for people to say that maybe they're thinking that a feature is unfair because of another reason. Now, what this graph shows is that actually most people picked one or more of the features of the reasons or the latent properties that we suggested, and very few people picked any latent property other than the one that we had on that list. Now, clearly, there are different extents to which these latent properties are influencing people's judgment. In fact, the one takeaway thing from this slide is if you actually look at the number of times people felt that a feature was unfair to use because of discrimination-related concerns. And the discrimination-related concerns are the ones that are about causing disparity and caused by sensitive feature. They're actually in the minority. That means a majority of the time when people are uncomfortable about using a feature, it's got less to do with discrimination, and it has got more to do with other types of unfairness concerns. Now, we wanted to quickly look at what causes the fairness disagreement. So, as we noticed, there is a considerable disagreement in the final fairness judgment, but this might be because you might disagree about the properties of a feature, or you might disagree about the mapping of the properties to the fairness judgment. Now, what I mean by this is, suppose there are two reasons. Suppose there is a feature, and we disagreed about whether it is fair or not. It might be because we actually assess the properties in an objectively similar manner, but we disagreed in the mapping of the properties to the feature. In fact, originally we thought most of the disagreement might come about not because people are going to disagree about the causal relationships, because we thought that's got to be objective, but that people might be putting different weights on the different properties, and therefore they might be, the mapping might be the one that is subjective moral reasoning, and therefore more likely to cause disagreement than the assessment of the properties themselves. Now, we wanted to test this, so what we did was we actually looked at the mapping function, and so we tried to, we took the assessments of the latent properties as inputs, and we tried to build classifiers to predict the output. And we were able to build classifiers with pretty good accuracy, but the most striking thing was we could build one classifier that was doing a pretty good job of mapping the latent property assessments to the fairness judgments for all people. Now, let me explain the implication of this. Originally, when we started this work, we thought the thing that people might disagree is with the mapping function. But actually, people are agreeing on that. Everybody is in agreement that if something has a causal relationship, it should be considered unfair. They're putting similar weights on all these different features. But where they're actually disagreeing is on what we thought would be objective factual estimates. Now, when we looked at the disagreements in the latent property assessments, what we found was that there was some consensus on whether on certain of these latent property assessments, like relevant reliability and privacy, but there is extremely low consensus on a whole number of these assessments of latent properties. And the striking thing here is a lot of those disagreements are about the causal properties. That means whether a feature actually causes a particular outcome. Now, we quickly looked at whether demographics have got to do anything to do with this fairness judgments. And we looked at people in our survey came from different races, education, gender, and surprisingly, we found no statistically significant differences there. But where all the differences came from are actually the political views of the people. So what ends up happening is if you are very liberal, you are more likely to rate usage of features as unfair, and that's because you start attributing a lot of you start attributing a lot of these features to actually causing the particular outcome. It's a bit more like, it plays into this traditional narrative of conservatives thinking that you are in charge of your life versus liberals thinking that the society is what ends up determining your life. And so many of them are related to that, to the ideologies of the respondents. So to summarize, the fairness considerations go beyond discrimination, that is beyond whether a feature is sensitive or non-sensitive. And there is significant disagreement in fairness judgments. And the disagreement, surprisingly, was in the objective latent property assessments, especially those related to causality, and they're correlated with the ideological views of people. However, there is surprising agreement in what I would have thought initially as subjective mapping from properties to fairness. Now, I'm going to conclude with just a comment on whether this is a good or a bad news for algorithmic fairness. And I'm still confused about how to interpret this. In one sense, it is a good news because what we thought might have been subjective moral reasoning, meaning two different people might say that I'm going to place more emphasis on certain latent property versus another, but there is surprising agreement over there, which means that if you had enough data, maybe you can resolve the conflict on the causal relationships by actually inferring causality from data. Of course, that would require a ton of data for you to actually scientifically or objectively infer the causal relationships, but there is hope that you could actually make the whole thing objective and get everybody to agree. On the other hand, it's also possible that people are actually deluding themselves. In some sense, they have a fairness judgment, and then they're actually believing in different facts about what feature might be causing or might not be causing a particular outcome. And if this were the case, if people start disagreeing about the causal graphs themselves, then a lot of this existing work on inferring causality and so on is not necessarily going to help in terms of bringing people together. So it really depends on how we would look at this. So since I'm out of time, I'm going to stop here. But there is, I just wanted to put up one more thing, which is I haven't told you about how do you actually take these human perceptions and actually incorporate them into algorithmic decision making. And this is some work that we have actually done and published at AAAI, and I would encourage you guys to check it out. But at this point, I'd be happy to take any questions and stop the talk.
So, excellent talk, Krishna. So, I have a couple of questions on the first part of your talk. So all the algorithms which basically were trying to make fair, so the assumption is that you already know the sensitive attributes, like gender, race, you already know that. In some situations, like for example, say ensemble learning or say output level ensemble learning, you do not know the meaning of features, right? And you do not know the exact meaning of the feature. Now, how do you know that which feature the algorithm is biased on? So is there any option to figure out the features on which the algorithm is already biased on?
So the thing is, when we're talking about, so one is to ask the question, which algorithm, which feature has the biggest influence on the outcomes, right? So that has been a question that many people are asking in the context of explainability, like which feature has the biggest impact? Now, of course, different features would have different amounts of impact. Now, where discrimination comes in is if one of the features that is deemed as having influence on the outcomes ends up being race or gender, then you would have trouble, because there are certain features that we want to consider them as kosher or sacrosanct, and you would want to say these features should have ideally no influence, right? So, and now if your question is that how are we going to know this if you don't have that information? That's actually would be very problematic. So in many situations, if you want to actually audit a decision-making system for bias, you actually need the sensitive information. And this is a well-known conflict that people have recognized sometimes before as well. So for instance, in certain countries, they don't gather statistics or census about race or ethnicity of people. But if you don't gather that information in your census, it will be really hard to do certain kinds of analysis about whether there are certain types of inequality in your data. So yes, so this sort of a work would actually make you rethink about what data you would actually need to do those kinds of analysis.
Okay. We can go. We'll come.
Yes, thank you. It was a wonderful talk. One question is that given the fact that you saw that many of the causal factors are where there seems to be disagreement. Now, if we start taking them out, we would end up with algorithms which are poor in the outcome. So how does one sort of solve this this trade-off?
So that's a fantastic question. So it is not clear to me. So I would answer it in two ways. One is actually the part that I didn't go into, which is the one where we try to incorporate human perceptions. What we actually talk about is ways of formulating learning so that you actually you actually trade off between performance and people's perceptions of fairness. That means we actually define the fraction of people who would consider a classifier as fair as those people who think that using each and every one of the features that the classifier uses as being fair. So now, anytime you're using more features, you end up getting higher accuracy or higher performance. But in the process, you would end up having more and more people thinking that your decision is unfair. So there is a clear trade-off, once again, between accuracy and perceptions of fairness. And so we did this thing, and then actually what you're fearing actually ends up showing up in that thing. So there is a trade-off, and the trade-off between accuracy and procedural fairness, as meaning like operationalized as the fraction of people who think using each and every one of the features is fair, that trade-offs are much worse than the trade-offs between performance and distributive fairness or outcome fairness of the type that we talked about before. So a lot of the people who did this work on discrimination, one of our satisfaction at the time was, well, even if you added these non-discrimination constraints, it's actually not decreasing the performance in practice too much. But then the moment you start taking procedural fairness into account, you actually end up taking much bigger hits on the same thing. Like we observed that it lowers a lot more. Now, what do you do in those situations? The answer is, I know that this may be very dissatisfactory. I don't know. These are things that we need to think about. The one way would be to say, my hope is that even though this is an idealistic hope that I feel like is never going to be realized, is that actually we get people to agree on the factual causal relationships, because somehow in my thinking, causal relationships should be objective. Maybe today we do not agree because we don't have enough data, but eventually I would like to believe that the causal relationships are not subjective and objective. And because we're actually agreeing on the mapping, which is more subjective, maybe there is hope that we will all come to an agreement, thereby avoiding these kinds of trade-offs. But otherwise, you might end up having a situation where the majority or the democratic way would be you actually elect people based on people who agree with your descriptive approach, and then they end up passing laws that becomes the normative approach, and that's how we end up introducing fairness in society.
Okay, so I think in interest of time, we might have to stop. Krishna is around, but let's thank Krishna again for a wonderful talk. I'll request Lipika to hand over it to Dr. Appreciation. Krishna.
Oops, sorry.